And I'm live after a little bit of a technical hiccup there. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. Um, I can't promise how long this is going to be because it's really hot where I am right now, and there isn't a whole lot in the way of air conditioning. But we'll see how it goes. Tonight's going to be a slightly more laid back episode. I was trying to think of a topic. I was thinking about talking some more about magic. And I may, but the other thing that occurred to me is I've had a pair of questions come in recently from viewers that I thought were actually pretty good. And maybe I ought to talk about those instead of just doing the usual, here's the topic, blah, 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 blah. So that's where we're going to be at the moment. I have two particular topic questions I'm going to get into tonight. One of which came to me through Facebook, one of which I found came in actually they both came through Facebook, come to think of it. But I think they're actually pretty good questions. And hey, Teresa Hall, Gold City Pagan, I'm great. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the chat as always. Okay, so the two questions that I want to look at tonight. One is a friend of mine actually asked me, what do I think about ghosts? Are they souls in purgatory? Are they something else, perhaps? And then the other question I had been asked, which was by a Catholic, they're Catholic who has a big interest in the paranormal, and they were concerned, is reading about Satanism and black magic and this kind of thing dangerous? And this is actually a question I get a lot, so I thought it was a particularly good question to cover for that reason as well. But let's get into it. I'll start with where do ghosts come from, which I've talked about a few times on this channel. Yeah, it is. It's so bloody hot. We have AC in my apartment, but it's in the bedroom. And the bedroom is a little too small to have like a desk and chairs and things of that nature. So I have to do it outside of the bedroom in the living room, which doesn't have an air conditioner. Ergo, this may be a short episode. But like I was saying, so in a very traditional Christian viewpoint, you have this idea that it is given to each soul to die once and then face judgment. So it's a common question among Christians: how can there be ghosts if they've already, because they die and they face judgment? They don't. The Bible also says the dead know nothing. And there's a couple of answers to this. I'll give a traditional Catholic one I kind of like, although I don't necessarily agree with it. And I'll explain why I don't agree with it, and I'll give my own thoughts. And I'll also address why how I believe it's true that the dead know nothing. But that doesn't mean they can't come back and speak to the living. So the usual Catholic explanation I've seen is you have this idea that there's heaven and there's hell, but they also have this idea of purgatory. Purgatory, which is largely fallen out of favor with many Catholics, this idea that to go to heaven, and I haven't been Catholic for a very long time. Any Catholics who listen to this, if I bungle your theology, I apologize. But I'm going to explain it as best I can for those who don't know. But if you're a good Catholic, you go to heaven. If you're a wicked person, you go to hell. This depends on a number of factors. But a particular question that comes in is the nature of sin. And a person who is loaded down with a certain amount of sin, they can go to heaven, but they have kind of like a spiritual debt for the sin they've had that they have to pay off. They have to be cleansed of this evil, of these things they have done, to be allowed in the glory of God. And this time period where they are purged, hence purgatory, is known as purgatory. It's traditionally believed, and this I'm much more certain on, that you spend varying amounts of time in purgatory depending on your sins in life. And that various things can be done by the living to help you along. This is where, for example, there's an idea of praying for the dead, because of this idea that that they're in purgatory working off the sins they committed in life. So by praying for them, you can speed it along. And this is an important idea to understand about the Catholic concept of purgatory, because particularly in pop culture, people often depict purgatory like there's a great cartoon on YouTube called Purgatoni, but it depicts it as kind of a middle ground. You're not good enough for heaven, not bad enough for hell. You go to purgatory, and eventually you wind up bouncing to one or the other. That's not really how Catholics see it, as I understand it. Souls that are in purgatory are going to heaven. You do not go to hell for there's no route from purgatory to hell, because of the fact you're somebody who's supposed to be in heaven, who has something they've got to atone for, before you can finish your journey. So one Catholic priest I've seen has suggested that if you see a ghost, if you interact with a ghost, what you should do is just pray for them to speed their time through purgatory. I personally, I think it's a good theory as it goes, but I personally don't really believe in purgatory. I don't think God makes you sit twiddling your thumbs in a waiting area until you're good enough. Than that. So that does raise this question. And I should point out as well that with Protestant Christians, there's this issue of, how can they go to purgatory? They should have faced judgment. They did face judgment. They've been judged worthy to go to heaven. They've been judged to be a good and faithful servant. It's the price that has to be paid for sin, and there is certainly this theology that Jesus paid the price for all sins, so that there's no reason they should pay that. But there's also this idea of penance and having to repent in Catholicism that isn't necessarily true in Protestantism. Although I have to say, regardless of my reservations about purgatory, I'm more of a fan of this. You have to repent. There has to be a sense of atonement, not just I feel really bad. I did the thing I did. Yes, Teresa Holgo City Pagan. I do think the waiting room in Beetlejuice is a good analogy. So that raises this question then of what are ghosts? If everyone goes either to heaven or hell, or even arguably Valhalla and various other afterlives, why do they wind up here? Now, the traditional answer, of course, is, well, they have unfinished business. But there's a spiritual question there, at least the Christian. Other religions have different issues. May not have this issue. I'm a Christian, so I can't necessarily speak with authority about anybody else's way of seeing things. But certainly I would think there's some degree of issue with reincarnation and other things of this nature of why are they stuck instead of going on to whatever's supposed to come next? My personal opinion is this. I think they're in a purgatory of their own making almost. At least some of them, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think that most ghosts, as we see them, are souls bound for heaven, who God has judged worthy of heaven, who have chosen to stay, and God in his mercy allows them to do so until they're ready to move on. I don't think God's going to drag a soul who isn't ready kicking and screaming to paradise. I don't care for that idea. So I think a lot of ghosts are just that. And you'll see this in a lot of cases where a lot of ghosts, specifically human spirits, are not malevolent. They're not trying to hurt people. They're trying, a lot of times they're just trying to get attention. There is a caveat to that. Because there are souls that have gone to hell that come back as well. For that matter, there are souls that have fully passed over to heaven that have come back. And harder to make an example in the hellbound example case, but the Bible even gives examples of people who have gone to heaven who came back. When Jesus spoke with Elijah and Moses on the mountain, they were in heaven. They were able to come back because God allowed it. When King Saul goes to the witch of Endor, she summons the spirit of Samuel. People have argued it was a demon in the shape of Samuel, which doesn't make sense contextually, but the Bible says it was the spirit of Samuel. I'm inclined to take that at its word. It's the spirit of Samuel, not a spirit that looked like Samuel. If it meant that, I think it would have said that. These are souls. So these are souls that God allows to come back from paradise for a purpose. And you can find dozens of examples, thousands of examples of this. And many of the people listening to this have probably had this kind of experience. When someone you love dearly dies, and you still sometimes feel a presence, or you'll get an odor that you associate strongly with them, or you may even see them or hear their voice, or any one of 100 other things like that. But it isn't all the time. It's not like you wake up every night and you hear grandma crying for you from downstairs. You hear it maybe a week after she died, maybe a night that you're very stressed out. You'll hear it again, or you hear it the first time. You'll see them even, and that's about it. Because here's the other thing, in my personal opinion. I don't think God tells souls that have gone to heaven and truly claimed paradise, nope, doors closed, you can't go back and visit the people you care about that are still dead, or still alive, I mean. That would be very cruel. Again, these aren't the damned. These are people that are in heaven. These are people who have lived their lives the way God wanted them to and gone to their reward. And you're really saying that, a mother who truly loves her child who dies can't come back and watch over her child from time to time? Does that sound like a loving God? It doesn't sound like a loving God to me. So now let's take a trip down under, as it were, because we can't never take yourself too seriously is an important rule about life, in my opinion. What about damned souls that come back? Well, there's two concepts I think that are worth exploring here. One is an idea from the play, The Tragical Comedy of Dr. Faustus. Because Dr. Faust asks the demon Mephistopheles, how can you be here when you're consigned to be punished in hell? And the demon explains that wherever we are, hell is there, and wherever we go, hell comes with us. People have this idea, and it's not entirely a wrong idea, but they have this notion that heaven and hell are literal physical places. Some people quite honestly seem to think that if you dug deep enough into the earth, you could find a big fiery pit with a guy with a pitchfork and horns sitting on a throne somewhere. I don't think you can. I don't think you can fly far enough into space to find God's throne either. They're spiritual places. But because they're spiritual places, they're not just places in the sense that we understand them. I'm currently sitting in the dining room of my house. That's a place. But heaven's also an idea. It's also a state of being. It's the state of being in God's grace. Whereas hell is the state of being cut off from that grace. An angel who comes to earth, and the Bible is certainly very clear they do that, doesn't leave God's grace and God's glory to come to earth. A demon who doesn't suddenly get filled again with the glory of God when it comes up from hell. The spiritual side of the reward or punishment continues even if you're not in the physical location. damned souls that are brought back by demons to torment the living. It isn't a reward for the damned, it's a punishment for the damned and a way of tormenting the living. Those souls don't enjoy themselves here. They don't want to be here. They don't want to be where they're going, where they came from either. But it isn't vacation. It's another way that they're used to further. They're a way that demons use further their own goals. This is all granted. This is a whole bunch of my opinion on theology. I can back up some of it scripturally. Like I said, there's certainly examples in the Bible of souls from heaven coming back under specific circumstances when God allows it. It's a little harder to do that for the other side of the equation, but I think it does happen because, again, I don't think they're leaving where they were. I think, and it's hard to explain this because it's not, we're physical beings. Where we are is where we are. We don't have this duality the way that the spiritual side of things does. There's also another possibility, which is what's called the stone tape theory. There's a theory, and I mean, it's hard to line up evangelicals who don't believe in spirits of the dead, who do believe in stone tape. But the idea is that events with a great deal of emotion, murders, the death of someone who's deeply loved, things like that, can leave an impression, particularly in stone. And that when certain events transpire, like possibly just the right ionization in the air from a storm, people with the right mental temperaments are present, some triggering event occurs, it replays those events almost like a videotape. I think this explains a lot of ghostly phenomena. Not all ghostly phenomena, but there are houses where they just hear footsteps in the middle of the night, and that's all that really happens. There's a famous road in England where they see Roman legionnaires march down the road, but they're cut off at the knees because the road was at a different height originally. But again, it's a repetition of events. It's not. There's no intelligence behind it. Now, the evangelicals will make the argument that the cases that have an intelligence behind them are demons disguising themselves as humans. And don't mistake me. That definitely happens. I've seen cases where the person thought they were talking to the loved one, and something demonic was actually behind it. I haven't had it personally, but Lou had a case where a woman was getting visits from her dead husband. And at first, it seemed like it was her dead husband, but then the haunting turned more and more malevolent, where her husband was a loving and kind man. Which actually is a neat dovetail into the second part of this. This question I want to get into, which is what does the Bible mean when it says the dead know nothing? And the many, many, many prohibitions against necromancy. You might remember what's the difference between necromancy and what I do with EVPs and things of that nature. These are all really good questions. So, historically, throughout time, there's been a magical practice that's called necromancy. It's been expanded considerably, but in its oldest sense, it goes back to at least ancient Greece. And it's summoning spirits of the dead for the purposes of divination. You call up the spirit of someone who's died to tell you about the future. Like I said, the Greeks did, in the oldest forms of it, it's actually a pretty nasty type of magic. Because traditionally, if you're going to actually truly perform necromancy, you need to dig up a dead body. It doesn't have to be the dead body of the spirit you're trying to contact. You just need a dead body that the spirit will inhabit and speak through. And you have to perform an elaborate magical ritual to try to keep demons out of the equation. And then usually you have to promise to burn the body afterwards so that that it can't be used for these kinds of purposes again. There's a reason that historically, while there are a number of types of magic that were tolerated, even in the Christian eras, nobody's really been too keen on necromancy, even the non-Christians. It's a messy art. I think when the Bible says the dead know nothing, this is what it's talking about. You don't gain any special knowledge when you, or at least if you do, you don't gain any special knowledge that you're going to be able to share when you die. The dead don't know what's going to happen. They're not omnipotent. Summoning them for the purposes of prophecy or to find out great secrets of the past and all that other stuff doesn't work because they don't know. They may know things about their own life, but trying to get information about the future, trying to get you can't. It's like, as you know, if you want to summon the ghost of Great Uncle Sal, ask Great Uncle Sal for tomorrow's lottery numbers. Great Uncle Sal doesn't know because if Great Uncle Sal was alive and you called him up, he couldn't tell you the lottery numbers then either, could he? There is no special extra knowledge that you get by being dead, or at least, again, if there is, and there's cases that can be made that, when you reach heaven, all of your questions are answered and things of that nature, you're not able to tell it to people here. And I think that's what the Bible's getting into there. And I think that's the difference between what I do in necromancy is when I'm trying to talk to a spirit of the dead, there's a point to it, but I'm not asking for knowledge. I'm not asking for any secret information. I'm just trying to establish that there's an intelligence that I'm working with. I may ask that intelligence for information, like when did they die, what is their name, but as to try to establish who I'm talking with, not necessarily, and to try to verify whether I'm dealing with a human or a demon, not necessarily this question of, can I find out tomorrow's lottery numbers? Can I find out, where, the Ark of the Covenant is by summoning up the spirit of an Israelite who was around when it got lost. And even then, the reality is that any paranormal investigator who doesn't understand this has an issue. There's a danger to trying to start conversations with spirits. Because whenever I start an EVP session, I don't know exactly what it is I'm talking to. It is a relatively innocuous method because of the fact, if I was using an Ouija board, which is not an innocuous method, for the board to work, I'm inviting the spirit to take a degree of control and a degree of physical interaction with me. Whereas with an EVP, it's interacting with entirely with an inanimate object that is not in no way directly connected to me. I can set the recorder 20 feet away. It's that invitation to come into a more direct contact, particularly because the planchette of Ouija board generally works because you're pushing it. That may even be the spirit probably on the subconscious, on some level, is actually manipulating you to move the planchette. But there's a more physical, intimate connection that you make with the board that you don't make with an EVP recorder. Okay, I think I've covered this reasonably well. Does anybody? I do have some live people with pulses, I think, unless you're ghosts, in the chat. If anyone has a question, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to the other question I've been asked. And then I may cover some other stuff, and then probably I'll get done again because it's hot. So the other question that I've been asked is, how dangerous is it to read about the occult and the paranormal? Particularly, the person asking was Christian, but I think it's a good question for anybody, particularly if you're reading about demons, demonology, Satanism. And again, as always, let me clarify when I say Satanism in this context, I mean devil worship and demonology. I do not mean Anselm LaVey's or the Church of Satan. Hey, Lord Ruin, I was talking about Ouija boards, yes, but um, again, I'm talking about actually worshiping the devil. Reading books of this sort, is there inherent spiritual danger? Mostly, I would say no. Um, for one thing, a lot of the books that are out there are utter nonsense. Um, I would love to visit your area, Teresa, as would Amisha. Um, we maybe once the quarantine and things die down, we can see a bit. And one of my long term goals actually is to basically get an RV and travel the country chasing ghosts, visiting some of the very many cool, wonderful people I've met over the years, seeing some of the amazing haunted sites in the world, and just seeing what I can find. What I see. I'm even thinking. I've even been actually just before the quarantine. We were talking about starting our own ghost hunting show, as it were, to be aired here on YouTube, and we'll probably pick the idea up again once things have died down some. Um, but to do a proper ghost hunting show, as we're not these, we're going to produce results if we don't get any, just to keep the ratings going. That's kind of why I want to do it on YouTube, because it's like if I go to a very famous haunted house, or even a not famous haunted house, and nothing paranormal happens, I want to show that. I want to do it as legitimately as possible. Sitting around in a living room for 8 hours and nothing happening isn't the most compelling TV, and obviously we'd wind up editing that down. But it's honest. Skeptic. Not many skeptics are going to go look at me sitting in a house having absolutely nothing happening, going, he's faking it. And hopefully, when we do eventually get something, and I think if we kept it up long enough, we would. That'll give it greater credibility, because it's like, no, I showed you the many times nothing happened. But now something weird's going on. And longer term, I wouldn't mind bucket list for life, getting an RV, traveling the country, and doing this full time. That kind of thing full time. That's a good question, Lord Ruin. Let me finish the question I was on that I got sidetracked from, and I'll come back to that. But that is an excellent question, and I will answer you. So, like I was saying, in terms of the question of, is it dangerous to read books on the occult, black magic, devil worship, and things of that nature, for a Christian or for anyone else for that matter? Mostly no. There is a concern about temperament. Certainly, if you already have something in your house, reading that kind of thing is going to make it worse, not better. And there's a concern of if you read long enough about black magic rituals, sometimes they're written in a certain. Some of them are written in such a way, and the text around them is written in such a way to make it seem innocuous. Make it seem, why don't you try it? And that can be very dangerous. But for the most part, knowledge itself isn't going to kill it. It isn't the problem. It's what you do with knowledge that's the problem. I think you're mostly okay to read those kinds of books. Again, otherwise, a lot of people out there, including a lot of fantasy horror and horror writers, would be in serious trouble because for every time they do research for what they're writing, there's a lot of the better ones do their homework. So I think that covers that pretty well. So let me get to Lord Ruin's question. Lord Ruin asks, did you ever go to someone's house to deal with a haunting, and it turns out their house isn't haunted, it's just the person is just nuts? Personally, I've never had to go to a house like that. I've done some cases where it's a little iffy if there was actually something there, but you just do a house blessing and get on with your day to try and reassure the person. I've talked to some people via email. This also, by the way, is why I don't like to call people or give out my phone number. But I've certainly talked to some people that weren't thought they were experiencing something paranormal that wasn't. I'll give you two examples of that, and I can give you an example of a case my mentor Lou Gentili did, or some cases my mentor Lou Gentili did. And actually, there is sort of the one I can talk about that was a mental issue. I don't want to say the person was just nuts. I'll get into why, but who thought they had something in their house. So I got so first of all, the one that was kind of just nuts. I got in contact with a woman many years ago. This is in the 90s. Some of you may or may not have been born yet. Just kidding. But who was very concerned that her house was haunted by a demon. So she had come up to me after a lecture that Lou had been giving, because he was still alive at the time. And we're talking about this. And at first it sounded pretty like, okay, there might be something there. And work schedules and other things like that, we hadn't been able to get out there yet. But after talking to her a little while, I find out that she suffers from a disorder called narcolepsy. Narcoleptics are not crazy. It's not a super common disorder, but it is fairly common. It's most famous for what's known as hyperpolysomnia, which is a very fancy way of saying that narcoleptics have a tendency to fall asleep at really weird times. Not as weird as you might think, because having researched the topic a bit, I've known a number of people with narcolepsy. But usually it isn't so much that you have this image of them like, they're going bowling, they throw the bowl and fall asleep in the middle of the alley. It was in a movie once, I believe. And things of that nature. It's not usually that, although it can be, I believe. Usually it's more like, think of all those times that the rest of us get drowsy during the day. When if you're doing data entry and just typing something very repetitive into a computer, if you're driving a very long straight road without any twists and turns, especially if there's nobody else around it, a lot of us have a tendency to start to doze off, zone out. Narcoleptics are much more likely to actually fall asleep. The reason why I can say I believe this is more than just that is there's also a famous case with a series of guard dogs. And I haven't looked in years, but you could at one time, you probably still can find video footage of them where they'd be out running around and then they'd fall over. After a while, they'd get back up, they'd run around, and they fall over. And what they realized is the dogs were actually falling asleep. And in fact, that basically the dogs had narcolepsy, and the evidence seemed to point to this particular neurotransmitter in their brain was missing, and that might be one of the causes of narcolepsy. I haven't researched it in years, so I don't know for certain. But there are four major symptoms associated with narcolepsy, and then a bunch of minor symptoms. But hyperpolysomnia is one. Cataplexy, which is another very odd one, is the one that's most distinct to narcolepsy, which is basically that many narcoleptics, when they experience a very intense emotion, it tends to be a specific emotion for each one, lose muscle tone and will just collapse. Laughter, for example. I've known a narcoleptic, for example, if they started really, really laughing, they fall on the floor. They knew it and they were able to control it better, and it didn't happen so much. I know I never saw it, but they were able to explain this to me. But the other two symptoms is where this really comes into play. One is what's called sleep paralysis, and the other, which is the hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucination. Sleep paralysis is a very common phenomenon. It happens to about 30% of the population. You wake up in the middle of the night and you can't move. Often it's described as feeling like there's a huge weight settled on your chest. About 30% of the population experiences this at least once in their life. Not all of those people have narcolepsy or any other sleeping disorder. Although if it happens often, it's probably a good thing to go see. If it happens at all, but especially if it happens often, it might be a good idea to go see a doctor. I don't give medical advice; it's just a friendly suggestion. But the other one is, again, hypnopompic and hypnagogic hallucinations. These are also very common. Many of us have had them at some point in our lives, particularly if you've ever experienced sleep paralysis. It's very common. Essentially, what happens during these types of hallucinations is you're physically awake, but you're still dreaming. It is technically hallucination, but basically it's a waking dream. They can be very terrifying and very bizarre. I've heard of narcoleptics because, again, it's very common with them, who have dreamed of mass gunmen breaking into their apartment, going into the room and shooting them in the head, killing them, and then they woke up. But it was so real and so vivid, they didn't realize it was a dream until they woke up. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. And all of her experiences that she described, and we ultimately got someone who was more familiar with psychology than I was to talk to her, because I was starting to suspect Stu at the moment, and realized that no, it was a symptom of a disorder she'd already been diagnosed with, not that she had a spirit in her house. This isn't to say that she wasn't nuts. It's a sleeping disorder. It's a malfunction in the way the brain processes sleep. Another case I had that I didn't actually do. I never met the client physically. Her, I actually met her a number of times, but I had another case where what do I think? A woman emailed me. Her daughter. She was very concerned about her teenage daughter, who was experiencing violent, and I mean physically violent, mood swings. She's angry all the time, particularly angry if anybody brought up God, brought up religion. Now, a lot of people I told this story to, fairly enough, will go, yeah, it's called being a... She had the terminal disease known as being a teenager. Most of us tend to go through that rebellious phase. It was worse than that. But it wasn't, but on the other hand, it wasn't spiritual. So talking to her, reading the email her mother sent me, mother mentioned that her daughter had something called PMDD. PMDD is a hormonal imbalance, specifically in women, specifically once a month, as I understand it. It's okay. With respect to women that are listening, because I know that there's at least one in the chat at the moment, there's this idea that women go crazy on their period. You may even in the past have heard of women who have committed murder because it was that time of the month. No, obviously, the vast majority of women don't commit murder because of mood swings. That's a ridiculous concept. This particular hormonal imbalance, though, pushes it so far out of whack, they can become physically violent, as I understand it. Again, and I do not misunderstand me. I do not mean to demonize people with PMDD or any other mental illness. The reality is the vast majority of people with mental illness are non-violent. Actually, statistically speaking, people with mental illness are twice as likely to be the victims of violence as they are the perpetrators of violence. But again, all of her symptoms could be explained by this disorder. And in fairness, I didn't know anything about it. I'd never heard of it before. Thankfully, I've made a long time point of making friends and making connections to people who know more about important subjects to my work than I do, like psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, and things of that nature. And I asked some of them who were able to fill me in. So the advice that we ultimately gave this woman was, in all compassion and respect, you should probably talk to your doctor, your daughter's doctors, about what's going on and how the medications don't seem to be working before you start thinking she's possessed. For 6 months, I didn't get a response. I thought I had insulted the woman. I had hurt the woman's feeling. I felt terrible about it. Because the reason I told her what I told her, the reason I tell anyone in this situation what I told her, is out of a place of compassion and wanting to help. Some people get very offended, and the next story I'm going to tell is an example of that. I thought that's what happened. About 6 months later, I got an email from the woman, and it turned out, yeah, she got her daughter on the medication in question. She talked to her daughter's doctors, explained the situation. They changed her medication. I don't know if they gave her a new medication or they changed doses, but they altered her medication schedule, and the problems got better. And hello, Parasite Records. Welcome to the chat. This saved me the trouble of having to drive anywhere, and it helped the person out, so I was absolutely thrilled. Um, the a lot of the times, if you've been doing this for a while, and I've been at this over 20 years, I had a little technical hiccup. It happens. But as I was saying, I think the majority of the thing was in there who don't, specifically who don't, because a lot of people who think that you have a spirit in the house do have a spirit in the house. But a lot of the ones who don't think that, a lot of people think they have a spirit in their house that don't. I know. I think a lot of the times it isn't so much because if you look at the idea that people try to fake us out and lie, I'm not saying it never happens, but I think the vast majority of the time, no, you don't call up a demonologist because you want to play. You might email him or leave a message on his chat with a stupid question. I've had a few of those, and actually, I'll give you an example of that in a minute too. But the majority of the time, you think you have a problem, and the time, they're not crazy. Again, I don't want to say that they're crazy. They're not even always mentally ill. Because here's the other thing you run into: some people have overactive imaginations without being crazy. Think about the last time you watched a really scary movie or TV show about ghosts alone, late at night. In fact, I'm willing to. I'd bet cash money that at least some of the people that watch this, either now or in the future, have watched a really scary movie very late at night, all by themselves. Unless you never do that, because some people won't do that. Do that if you paid them. But you watch a movie late at night by yourself, then you hear the floorboard creak. And if only for that one moment, you probably jumped 10 feet in the air and screamed. You don't have to admit it, but I know at least some of you have. It's a very human response. And if it's a sign the movie did its job properly, for God's sakes. Some people, when they have that jump, decide to call somebody like me. Again, it's not that they're dishonest or they're deceitful or they're trying to trick me. It's people let their imagination get carried away. It's a pretty common thing. I thought of one more example of my own, and then we'll get to a Lou example. Think of one example I had recently, in fact, of somebody I think either was trolling me or was outright nuts. Because I had somebody who was in Africa, which is a big problem because I live in the United States and I'm broke. If I thought the case was legitimate, it's a big problem to go to Africa to investigate it. But they're telling me about how they'll wake up and they'll be unable to move and they'll see very bizarre and disturbing things. But it's only ever when they're just before they fall asleep, just after they wake up, They're the only ones who ever see it. It's pretty textbook sleep. I politely suggested they may want to consult a doctor. Then they start feeding me extra bits of info. Particularly, they feed me this info at the very end when I kind of write the whole thing off. And this is what makes me suspect it was a prank. Tell me about how one night they were on the edge of their property and they saw essentially a group of people in black robes fly by on broomsticks. Either that guy was missing some screws, not just loose, or somebody was pranking me. I don't know which. But that's the point when I use that useful little feature known as block and went home with the day. Lou did have a case, though, that is extremely funny, and the example is a lady with a few screws loose. He did a case in the Pocono Mountains region of Pennsylvania. It's about a half-hour drive for him. This is before I met him, so no, I wasn't there. Poltergeist in her house. She'd go to work, she'd come home, her house was destroyed. Furniture thrown everywhere, everything, stuff shattered, whole 9 yards. He rolls up, goes inside, and yeah, this house looks like it looks like a bomb went off in it. Now, Lou was, like myself, Lou was not psychic. But when you've done this as long as he had, or at this point as long as I have, you get kind of a feel for a place. And it's not 100%. It's not, again, not, but it's a pretty good instinct of whether or not something's actually there or not. And he's not feeling this place at all. She brings out, she's talking about all this. It gets worse because she started talking about all this weird, I want to say new agey, but even for the new age, it was weird about how there were these time-traveling koala bears that wore army helmets that were protecting space time. I wish I was making this stuff up. But it's pretty clear to Lou that this lady's Fruit Loops. And finally, she offers to play an EVP of the spirit voices she got. Lord Ruin asked, is this the person with the crystals? I don't know. Mentioning crystals, to be honest with you, it may be. But anyway, she offers to play the EVP of the spirit voices. Hey, Lisa for Truth, long time no see. Welcome to chat. And the minute Lou hears this EVP, he knows something's fishy. Lou got more EVPs than any other person I've ever known. He knew exactly what they should sound like. These are the qualities you'd expect from one. And this wasn't hitting any of those marks. So he takes a look at the recorder. It's on slow play. It's not the voices of spirit. It's shouting at for being unruly. So here's what's actually going on. And this is not, those of you who own pets will understand this pretty quickly. If you haven't guessed already, at the moment I said dogs. What you're running into is that plenty of animals get separation anxiety, especially when you just bought them. She was leaving the house. Her dogs were running amok and destroying the house. She was coming back. Now, the woman had a mindset you find in many parents and many pet owners. Precious babies. And that combined with her new age beliefs is what landed her on demons, poltergeists. That's another thing you run into. And this is endlessly fascinating to me because I've seen this many times over the years. There are a lot of people in this world that really want to live in a haunted house. Even a violently, and even not only sometimes even not even in a, but especially in a violently haunted house, because the really violent are the ones where you get all the crazy activity, and that's what they want. The common way to manifest is that people will convince themselves that the house is haunted when it really isn't. Sorry to hear about the straight throat, Lisa. We actually should talk, because now that I'm using this new Jitsi program, it'd be very easy to have you come on. For that matter, it'd be very easy for me to come on your channel because it's free. You don't even need, as long as you're using, you only have to download anything to use it as an app on your phone. It's very easy to add people on and things like that. But that gets off subject. That's what, there was, yeah. But again, you get a lot of these cases of people who really want their house to be haunted. So if it isn't haunted, they'll imagine that it's haunted. If they, and or for that matter, if it is in fact haunted, they don't want to have an exorcism. They want you to come and tell them that their house is really haunted. They can brag to all their friends that they have a house that is certifiably haunted. This isn't even necessarily always a bad thing. When you're dealing with ghosts, certainly it's not a big when you have a, but it only works very well for some businesses. There are hotels, for example, that have made a great deal of money by advertising themselves as the most haunted inn in whatever state. They rent out, there are hotels that rent the haunted room out for slightly more than all the other rooms, even though it's functionally the same. And there's all these other groups and places out there that make money and are very successful on this idea that they're haunted. It amuses me. I don't particularly actually have a big problem with it because got to make money somehow. And did it shouldn't freeze? Have I ever been to Mackey's Bar? No, I'm not familiar with that one. I'll say the example I've been thinking of particularly. Well, I can think of two examples, but one which is where I grew up is an inn called the Logan Inn. No, I have not been to Lizzie Borden House. I've been dying to go though. There's an inn in New Hope called the Logan Inn. It's one of the 5 oldest continuously operating inns in the United States. It was built in 1722. And it makes a pretty successful career about claiming to be haunted. The Lizzie Borden House, of course, which is the house where Lizzie Borden may or may not have murdered her family with an axe. We don't know. There's a bunch of questions that have been asked about that over the years. Teresa Hall Ghost City Pagan commented, "They are welcome to visit, and if we get along, they can haunt my house, but I'm the boss." For that matter, I haven't heard anything about a while, but I know a few years ago, Waverly Hills, which is a very infamous abandoned psychiatric hospital, was supposedly being turned into a bed and breakfast. If I was more on the ball order when I make a joke about the song, but he asked if the Hotel California is haunted. Probably. I think here's another thing you run into. A lot of most historical places tend to have at least one spirit hanging around. May not be very active, but anywhere that's been standing for a few hundred years probably has a ghost. Case in point, in parts of Europe, particularly if you the British Isles, if your house isn't haunted, there's something wrong with you. I mean, seriously, there's a Scottish story I remember reading as a kid called "The House That Lacked a Boggle." A boggle is a Scottish name for ghost, and it's an entire story about a house that isn't haunted. And how it eventually gets a ghost, because It's a house that isn't haunted and a ghost that doesn't have a house to haunt in synergy. But it's the U.S. because everything here is relatively young. You have this is another common misconception people have. People have this idea that, well, my house just got built and it can't have a ghost. Sure can. I mean, one, it can have demons and other nasty and elementals for that matter because of the land that you built it on. But it can actually have, a house you bought that got built today might have a ghost if the land that if you build your house on top of a cemetery. And I know how silly it sounds, but it has happened. Lou was actually involved in a case, again, sadly, before he was involved with it. Oh, really? I don't know. Lauren said, isn't the Hotel California where Anton LaVey wrote the Satanic Bible? I don't know. I only know the Hotel California from the song The Hotel California. I didn't actually, before you asked, to be completely honest, I didn't even know it was a real place. And there again, we could go on forever about famous haunted places. There are lots of them. In my experience, the ones that people know the best usually are the least active. If you really want to see crazy stuff, you gotta dig a little deeper and for the places off the beaten path people don't know about. That isn't always true. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philly is extremely haunted and is famous for it. And yes, I have actually been there. Which is a fact. If you got any of you guys who don't know about it, if you're ever in Philadelphia, I highly recommend going to see Eastern State Penitentiary. And you don't even just have to go for the ghost stuff. It's a fascinating building. It is the very first penitentiary on the planet. It was built in the 1800s based on an idea that was put forward by a group of men called the Philadelphia Society, one of the members of which was Benjamin Franklin. Oh, good Lord, yes, the terrible lawn is supposed to be incredibly haunted. But Eastern was built with this plan of, we're going to reform how prisoners are kept. Every cell had a skylight, so they have light during the day, had a copy of the Bible, and a bed, and some kind of work to do, usually making shoes. Every prisoner was forced to stay in their cell alone 23 hours a day. They were let out an hour a day for exercise, during which they had to wear a bag over their heads. The idea was they wanted to make prison such a horrible place no one ever wanted to go back. It was eventually reformed because the reality is that doesn't work. And it actually has held a couple of famous prisoners. One of whom, by far the most famous prisoner it ever held, was a guy from Chicago. See, there's been a big meeting in Atlantic City among the various mob families from around the United States. Question is, okay, prohibition's on the way out the door. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to survive the end of prohibition? As I understand it, I've heard different versions, but as I understand it, essentially what happens is this particular Chicago mobster had got a little big for his britches, and the other families decided they were going to teach him a lesson that he had to go away for a while. He was pulled over on his drive home while he was in Philadelphia, caught for a concealed weapons charge, and locked up in Eastern State Penitentiary for 1 year. Because of his prominence, he was allowed to have Oriental logs and antique furniture. They keep his cell, which was in the center of the whole thing, because basically it was designed like a wagon wheel. We had a central building, and then you had the various cell blocks jutting off of it like spokes. In fact, this design's been copied over and over and over and over again. But most of the guards would stay in the center, because from the center you could look down any hallway, see all the way down to the end to check on the guards, and then at the very end, because they were all L shapes, there was mirrors that you could even see down that way as well, without having to walk all the way down there to see what's going on. And the name of this particular Chicago mobster was, yes, Al Capone. This is long before Goodfellas. It was Capone. This was before he was ultimately caught and sent to prison for good for tax evasion. But the other guy that they had isn't nearly as famous as Cabone, but he is pretty well known, and he is a lot of fun. Which is a guy by the name of Willie Sutton, or also, although he hated the nickname, he was called Slick Willie. Slick Willie was a bank robber. What he would do is he would show up at the doors of a bank just after it had opened, walk in, pull out his Tommy gun, say empty the safe, walk out. When they caught him, he famously said they never carried bullets in his guns because he never actually wanted to hurt anybody. And to be fair, neither the Tommy gun nor the pistol that he carried on any of his his robberies was loaded when he was finally captured. He's also very famous. The thing he's most famous for, though, is he was famously asked by a reporter, "Why do you rob banks, Willie?" And the reporter reported that Willie's answer was, "Because that's where the money is." It's not actually why he did it. Later in his book, That's Where the Money Is, he would elaborate. In reality, he robbed banks for the thrill and the excitement. Not. Charles Lamb offered, he believed that the theory of Eastern State Pen was not to punish, but to force them to commune with God through their inner voice, because there was nothing else to do. It is a Quaker concept. That's true, and I think the answer may be a little bit of both. But I also just may be wrong. You may be right. That does sound logical because Pennsylvania was primarily, Benjamin Franklin himself, of course, was not a Quaker. PA was very heavily Quaker, so a lot of the people involved, as I understand, I believe a lot of the people involved with the committee that ultimately designed it were Quakers. But so anyway, the other cool thing about Slick Willie is, the stereotypical prison escape. He did it. He actually used a spoon to tunnel out. Him and about 6 other prisoners tunneled out of the prison and escaped. They were caught quickly afterwards. I think the longest might have lasted something like 2 weeks. But yeah, he was housed in Eastern State. Capone was housed in Eastern State. It's a messed up place. I've been there. If you give them enough money, they will allow a group of investigators to investigate there at night. You don't have to do that. Like I said, they do tours during the day. I don't entirely approve of it, although I understand why they do it. They also do a haunted house around Halloween every year. But it is an incredible place. I highly recommend, if you're ever in Philly, check it out. I grew up in that area. I grew up in New Hope, so that is a thing for me. There are so many cool, and that's another thing you run into when you're doing this type of work, is there are so many cool and interesting places. I've mostly stuck to houses for many, people's houses for many years, because people are usually the ones that have problems that need help. But when I did more historical sites, one of the things I always loved is, even if nothing paranormal will happen, some of these places have some amazing stories about them. There's a jail in Pennsylvania, and I don't remember the name of the jail, but it used to be very close to where I lived, which famously has a handprint on the wall. But it was the site of where the Molly Malones, some of the first the Union Inns and the Coles and things like that, where they were housed. There's so many places. So many of these places have important history tied to them. You'll find something. I always recommend going and checking out some of these places, only because even if you don't see a ghost, you may learn something cool. I mean, the Logan Inn, it's the very first haunted place I ever. That's a really good topic, and I'm actually going to address that, partly because this is an old sticking point of mine. So Lisa commented that Vlad Drax's castle is haunted. If it's haunted, actually, I don't think it is, and I'll get into why in a second. On the other hand, there is another site that might actually be haunted by Dracula himself, if some of the legends are to be believed. So, Dracula's main castle. Oh, yeah, two fortresses. One which was at Trigovist, which was the capital of Valentia. But the main castle, the one everybody thinks of, was at Ponare, which is up in the Transylvanian Alps. It has a river running past it that is called the Princess River because his wife drowned herself in it. Yes, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula gets that actually correct. His wife did drown herself. He got why she drowned herself wrong. The reason she drowned herself is the castle was about to be taken, and most historical reports suggest that she didn't want to see the castle taken. She didn't want to have to flee, and that's why she killed herself. But here's the thing, and this is why I'm disinclined to think. And even if it is haunted, the castle at Ponare, you're not going to get out there to see much, because the castle in Ponare, unfortunately, was hit by an earthquake in the 19th century. It's a pile of rubble. There's been some efforts to restore it, but it's still mostly ruined. And the reason you're not going to really want to spend any time out there at night is it's in a fairly remote part of Romania. There are issues with wild dogs on that area. It's not a great place to hang out at night. On the other hand, there's Snagov Monastery. So Vlad Dracula is a really interesting case, and I've talked about him before, but I think at some point in the future I'm probably going to do another video on him. But as brutal as he was, he generally saw himself as Christian. For most of his life, he was Eastern Orthodox, as was just about everybody in Romania. And then very late in his life, he converted to Roman Catholicism for political reasons. And to get himself out of prison, which is a whole other story. But one of the things he commonly did in his life was build churches and monasteries, some of which survive to this day. One of which is Snagov Monastery, which is ruins of it do survive. It's not intact, as I understand it. I've read legends of people seeing a headless corpse wandering Snagov. What makes the significance of the story of Dracula is that we don't know exactly how Dracula died. There's a number of versions of what happened, but he died in battle, possibly killed by his own men who mistook him for a Turk, possibly killed by Turks, possibly killed by the boyars, the local landed nobility, as an act of treason because they hated him. Possibly it was the work of his brother, who was Radu, who was definitely traitorous. We honestly don't know. But what we do know is that when Dracula died, the Turks, his great enemies, cut his head off and took the head back with them to Mehmed II, the Sultan that was Dracula's great rival, to prove that he was dead. And the headless body is supposedly buried at Snagov. The story gets much more fun because when Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally, the authors of In Search of Dracula, went digging at Snagov, they found cattle bones in what was supposed to be his grave. I asked Radu at one point, or not Radu, Raymond, because we had him on the Lou's show way back in the day. One theory he had offered is that they needed to dig deeper. He thought he may have been buried under the bones they found. And there's also speculation he was buried somewhere else from the monastery. I've heard stories that there is actually a skeleton of his that they thought might have been his that was found that later vanished out of a museum in Romania. But Snagov is quite possibly where he's buried, and it may very well be haunted by his spirit. The other castle that people associated with him that may or may not have been haunted, depending on who you ask, is Castle Hunindai in Hungary, and more specifically, actually, it might be in Transylvania, or might be in Romania now because it was in Transylvania, which Hungary and Romania have spent the better part of the last 100 years fighting over who got to own Transylvania. It came up during the First and Second World Wars. We don't know. It's a large, kind of one of those. But at any rate, he was captured and held in prison in Castle Honduras for about 10 years. For that matter, there's Mehmed II's fortress in Turkey that might have something that might be haunted because of him, because he was imprisoned there for many years because of a political deal between his father and the Sultan. Not, I don't think Mehmed, but Mehmed's father, um, where basically Radu, Dracula's brother, and Dracula himself were both taken as hostages against their father's good behavior. And supposedly he started learning torture there and would impale. Turkish records claim he even would impale small rodents and things like that for his own amusement. But yeah, the reason this is all a personal sticking point for me, if anybody's wondering, is that years and years and years ago, there was a TV show called Fox Family Channel's Scariest Places on Earth. And they always would air. They aired 5 episodes right around Halloween. Losing the first season in Eastern State Penitentiary. I had only just met Lou, so for that reason and some others, I didn't get to go with him. Year 2, I was working on the radio show by then. They approached Lou again to do another segment. And since I have, there's as I've talked to you many times about on my channel, there's a reason that my title is Paranormal Encyclopedia on here. He came to me and asked, well, where would I suggest? So I looked at him and went, wait, does it have to be in the United States? Like, no, but I'd like it to be. Why? Well, where would you want to go if you go anywhere? So I suggested the ruins of Dracula's castle at Panare, and prepared a little presentation on the history and the various castles and why. Because there are two, the other castle that's often associated with Dracula, and the one that you'll see in all of the tourist literature is Castle Bran, which is actually in the Carpathian Mountains and in Transylvania, and this big, cool-looking castle that, as far as we know, Dracula never even lived in. It wasn't Dracula's castle by any real definition of the word. It's possible he may have lived there. His family had strong connections. His father ruled Transylvania for a time, and the other, it's hypothetically possible he lived there at some point in his life, but he had no dominant relationship to Bran Castle. They chose Bran over, say, Panare because Bran is this big, impressive, cool-looking castle. It's not at Burgo Pass like in the novel, nor is it on the mountain that's mentioned in the novel, but it's close. And it's like, are we going to show this really cool castle that looks like Castle Dracula, or are we going to show the pile of rubble in the wrong part of the country, over 100 miles away in the wrong part of the country from the novel? There's also an argument that Bram Stoker intended Bram Castle to be Dracula's castle. There's no reason to believe that. None of his notes mention it. As far as we can tell, as far as anyone's ever been able to tell, he probably wasn't even aware that Bran Castle existed. But at any rate, we gave him all this information. We didn't hear back. Then they basically announced, told Lou, we're not going to do it. Because the reality is that Dracula is actually a national hero in Romania. He's a very big deal there. They're very iffy about any association with him and vampires. And I had even said that this might be an issue. But supposedly that was the reason why they weren't going to do the segment with us there. I say about a month later, the advertisement started. Watch a family spend the night in Dracula's castle. So they ripped off my idea and gave it to somebody else, which ticked me off all by itself. And then they got the details all wrong. They made it one of a castle in Transylvania that was owned by the Hunniday family. That existed at the time, but wasn't even actually where Dracula was held prisoner. They made up all this BS about vampires, and just, yeah, I wasn't pleased. Let me see. Well, I meant this to be relatively short, and it's actually longer. So everybody's been quiet for a while. I mean, supposedly I've got 5 people watching. Does anybody have any questions? I'm probably going to wrap this up shortly, unless there's any more questions, comments. Anyone want me to weigh in on something? It has cooled off slightly, so I don't mind spending a little longer here if anybody wants. But otherwise, I'll probably call it a night in a minute. If you have a question, speak now or forever hold your peace, at least until the show next week. I should say I do want to apologize for not doing a show last Saturday. Like I think most of you probably have been very upset by the situation in this country in the last couple of weeks. I talked about my feelings about that already. In the video before this, about the protests. I do not want to make this into a political channel. I'll just say my prayers are with everyone. It is with all the people that need them. Teresa, I'm glad you're enjoying the Dracula talk. I love Dracula is absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, I have to be honest. Like when I had invited Dacre to join the Wrath of Khan a few weeks back, he was very grateful to me for including him. I can't begin to describe how much I keep fanboyed out about having him. Let justice be done is what I think. Again, not that I don't disagree with Lisa, but because I want to avoid making this a political show as much as I can. Let me just say that in the wake of what happened to George Floyd, may justice be carried out as it must, as it should, I should say, not as it must. You can take that however you will. I think everyone on both sides should agree that we want to see justice done. So Lord Ruin asks, are the ways you exercise or deal with non-European ghosts different than European ghosts? I've never actually tried to exercise a European ghost, so I can't say for absolute certain, but to the best of my knowledge, the ritual Romanum. Well, granted, the ritual Romanum is meant for demons, not ghosts, but generally speaking, the rituals that are used by the Catholic Church in particular are the same both in the United States and in Europe and Quebec. And usually, you don't exercise ghosts so much as do a house blessing to help to try to move on. Thank you, Teresa. I really appreciate you sharing the link to him with other Dracula fans. Tell you what, in fact, to further bolster the fact that you and I both like Dracula, you can tell any Dracula fans you know, next week's show I'll do about Dracula. I'll talk a lot about the historical Vlad the Impaler. I could even talk some about Dracula in the book and in folklore. Lord Ruin, you commented because ghosts in different cultures function pretty differently. They do and they don't. There's actually a lot of common ground in European ghost folklore. Ghost folklore in Asia, particularly Japan. I don't know a lot about Asian ghost folklore, but particularly Japanese ghost folklore, which is what I know the most about, is wildly different than it is in Europe. Particularly because ghosts in Japan aren't ghosts in the sense that we think of them in the United States. They have physical bodies. A lot of as I understand it, I'm not an expert, but pretty much most ghosts in Japan are pissed off, which has to do with the nature of the Japanese underworld and their Shinto beliefs and things of that nature. And I'm not going to try to get into too much into how exactly, because I'm going to mangle it because I just don't know that much about Japanese religion. Vlad, that's a good question about Vlad the Impaler. Let me finish my thought on Lord Ruin, and I'll come back to your question, Lisa. But um, there's a lot of common ground in most ghost stories. Cute, Teresa. Very cute. Gonna have to ask Virgo about that one, I think. Um, but yeah, I think one size fits all pretty well for most ghosts in my experience. I think in reality, ghost, demon, angel, to some extent, ghost, demon, vampire, werewolf are more labels that we slap on things than hard and fast lines. Um, that's a really good question, Lord Ruin. If I had to deal with a ghost from Japan, would I be forced to alter or change my approach in dealing with them? If I had to deal with a Japanese, I think they call Yurei is what they call the ghosts, and it was an actual Japanese Yurei, I probably would. And I wind up talking to a Shinto priest or Buddhist because they have their own rituals for doing that. But I'm inclined to think that probably Western methods would work pretty well on them, and for that matter, Eastern methods work pretty well on Western ghosts. I don't think spirits care all that much about the ritual nature of the ritual, is the intent and the focus and the will and the faith behind the ritual. But did want to answer Lisa's question, even though again I'm going to do next week's show about Vlad the Impaler and Dracula in general specifically. No, I do not think that Vlad the Impaler, aka Vlad Dracula, was nearly as bad as most Western history depicts him as. Here's the thing to realize: most of the records that we have of Vlad's reign come from either the Germans or the Russians or the Turks. There were a lot of land disputes going on between Germans that were living in Romania at the time, or Wallachia at the time, and Vlad, that led to some violent conflict. There were issues with the Russians at the time, and Vlad spent his entire career at war with the Turks, just about. These are not unbiased sources. And it would certainly have been in their intention, I think, to demonize this enemy of theirs. This is not to say that he was a saint and some perfect person who never did anything brutal. But here's the other thing to remember. We're talking Vlad lived from 1431 to 1476. The Inquisition was still prominent in Europe. The Borgias were a big deal in Europe. It was even in Western Europe, things were not nearly as peaceful as people imagined them to have been. His methods were cruel, and I'm not gonna say that they weren't. I mean, he did like to impale living people on wooden poles and watch them slowly die. And unsurprisingly, people have made all sorts of homoerotic speculations about why he did that. I'm sure all of you are shocked. But by and large, his tactics were more brutal than some, but not as bad as others. And I think a lot of the random things he supposedly did. I mean, there's stories that he would impale nursing women through the chest twice, and then impale the baby on top of it between the two on both of the stakes. And other acts of mindless cruelty that serve no purpose probably aren't true, or probably exaggerations. I'll give you an example of why I think this. There's a somewhat well-known story that he gathered up all the poor people in Wallachia and offered them a great feast, and then asked, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" And they asked him to relieve them of their earthly burdens. And then he said, "Well, certainly," and had his guards seal the room and then set it on flame. Something like that did actually happen. But the people that it happened to weren't peasants, and they were by no means poor. So there were people, like I mentioned earlier, there was this landed nobility in Wallachia, known as the Boyars. Boyars are kind of local land barons, mayors. They're rich. They have a lot of political power, and they were not nice people. In Vlad's reign, they were known for excessively taxing the poor. They were also, at least some of the ones in question, were almost certainly responsible for the murder of both his father and his older brother. Because Vlad's father was Vlad Dracul, which is one thing that always bugs me is you'll hear people call the one from the book Dracul. It's like no, Dracul was daddy. Dracula is the one that is Dracula's. But his older brother Mania was buried alive by the Boyars. So what actually happened, and there's some records of this, is that Vlad brought together a bunch of the Boyars, including the men he was quite certain were responsible for his relative's death, gave them a big feast, locked them up in the room, and then set fire to it. Now, he still burned a lot of people alive, which is not, I'm not saying that's not a horrible event, but there's a world of difference between taking a bunch of rich, greedy robber barons and murderers and setting them on fire, and taking a bunch of innocent peasants that only crime is being poor and setting them on fire. I'm not justifying either action. I'm just saying I'm a little more sympathetic to one than the other, if you can understand me. And I think his enemies are quite surviving Boyars because he continued to have problems with them throughout his reign. Like I said, they're among the candidates for who killed him. I think they probably spread the story to make him look bad. But again, it's hard to know for sure because of the fact a lot of our surviving records are from his enemies, and they aren't the most unbiased sources. Some of the things we know that he did that, and now I'm getting into a whole other episode here. But some of the other things that we do know we did were quite generous, and I'm thinking I'm going to get into those next week because I've been going a good hour and a half now. Not that I mind; I always like hanging out with my wonderful listeners. You guys are great. I want to thank Charles Lamb, Lisa for Truth, Lord Ruin, It's a Whole Gold City Pagan, and Parasite Studios. Was it? I want to thank all of you for joining me in the chat and asking me some really good questions. But I think that's going to do it for tonight. If you've enjoyed this, please take the time to share it to like and comment, subscribe if you haven't already, share it with your friends, and then you might also, if anybody's got a couple of bucks to kick around, you might consider donating to my Patreon. Link in the description below. If anybody listening to this has a question I haven't covered tonight that they would like to ask me, or if you think your house may be haunted or you need help, my email is also in the description below. I do check my email daily, so if you email me, I will get back to you. There's somebody who has actually reached out to me recently. I haven't been able to get back to them. I apologize that it's on work. It's basically I've been busy with work. I will be doing so soon. But that's going to do it for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for tuning in. This is Kevin Mears, Demonologist and Paranormal Encyclopedia. Wishing you all a wonderful week. Good night, and God bless.